Good evening, everyone. My name is Maya Nilel. Can you hear me? My name is Maya Nilel. I'm the Assistant Director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. Like last week, we would like to begin by saying a bit more about this speaker series. The 6 months since October 7th have been a time of enormous pain. They've compelled our attention as citizens and humans. They also compel us to learn more. As a first step, Mina, Crown, and Buffett came together and decided to bring a diversity of scholars to campus to help us delve into the foundational roots of the 100 years of struggle between Israel and the Palestinian people. We decided to focus on this early history because in our own teaching, we've found that people often have questions about it. In addition, this history is essential for understanding all that has happened since.
Thank you, and my name is Wendy Perlman. I'm the Interim Director of the Middle East and North Africa Studies program here at Northwestern. So we encourage you to return to future sessions, to ask questions during the Q&A, and to use the QR code on the back of flyers to offer any feedback that you wish. Last Thursday, Professor Arie Dubnov launched the series with a wonderful talk about late Ottoman Palestine. He made the argument that the area was generally characterized by religious coexistence and that sectarianized conflict really increased after World War I. A video of Dr. Halaby's talk is available on the Buffett Institute website, and the link for where all videos will be available is also on the flyer in yellow print at the bottom of the first page. So we will continue to post videos of all flyers shortly, or all talks shortly after they take place. And as the series is organized to move chronologically through time, the next stop on our historical journey is to examine Zionism in its multiple forms in historical context. For this, we now turn things over to David Shayevitz, Director of the Crown Center, who will introduce our second speaker and moderate today's talk.
Hello, everyone. I have the wonderful pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Professor Arie Dubnov, who is Associate Professor of History at George Washington University, where he also holds the Max Tickton Chair of Israel Studies. He's a historian of 20th century Jewish and Israeli history, with emphasis on the history of political thought, the study of nationalism, decolonization and partition politics, and with a subsidiary interest in the history of Israeli popular culture. He is the author or editor of 3 books, among them Partitions, a transnational history of 20th century territorial separatism that was published in 2019 with Stanford University Press. That one traces the genealogy of the idea of partition in the British interwar imperial context. And fittingly for today's session, he's also the editor of the book Zionism, A View from the Outside, published in 2010 in Hebrew by Mossad Bialik. This latter one is a book which seeks to put Zionist history in a larger comparative trajectory. He's published numerous articles in a really remarkably diverse roster of leading journals, including Nations and Nationalism, Modern Intellectual History, Jewish Social Studies, the Journal of Israeli History, and many others. His current book research project, which is tentatively entitled Dreamers of the Third Empire/Temple, examines ties between Zionist and British imperial thinkers in the interwar years. And today's topic for his talk is Zionisms, Variations on a Theme. Please join me in welcoming Professor Arie Dubnov.
Thank you, David, for this generous introduction. Thank you, Mayan and Wendy, and for putting this series together. I know how many institutions are steering away from difficult conversations, but I applaud you for taking the academic mission seriously. And I looked at the series. I'm very honored to be part of it, and I really envy. I would love to attend all these lectures, so I will follow the link for sure. So this afternoon, I have a daunting task on throwing at you something that I have usually a semester, if not 2, to unpack with my students. So in a way, one can mock and say this is like a quick and dirty crash course on the history of Zionism. And in a way, a lot of what I will do is try to unpack the different branches or variations of Zionism. And a lot of what we will do, I'll try to do, And it will be by nature very telegraphic. A lot of the things I will say will be only touches of it. I'll be touching a tip of an iceberg, hoping that this will encourage you to ask more questions, and then I'll have the easy Q&A that I will set already the plans of what you will ask. So a lot of what I'll do, I'll try to unpack the kind of very schematic graph you see here. But I want to say before that some preliminary kind of or academic jargon, methodological approaches about how I approach it as a historian, as an intellectual historian, and also in a way to allude, regardless of the meager circumstances in which we have this series, to what is happening in the historiography, what is happening in the field of the story of history of Zionism, so to speak. And in a way, the good way of introducing this revisionist kind of approach is to talk about, I'm borrowing this term from Ludwig Wittgenstein, the famous German philosopher, the concept of family resemblance. What do I mean by family resemblance? In the past, we had a tendency to think about Zionism. It even reflected in type of titles of books you will have that, such as the Zionist idea, the Zionist ideology, almost like a principle of faith. It has a doxa. It has like a set, a very limited set of ideas. Once you subscribe to these ideas, to that doxa, so to speak, then you're part of that church. And more historians are acknowledging something that probably won't find surprising, is that the chronicles of the history of the Zionist movement is one debate after the other. As the joke goes, you put two Jews in a room, you already have at least 4 opinions. So why would you think that the history of Zionism is any different? And understanding these kind of different branches also led people like myself to talk about this idea of family resemblance. Instead of thinking about one central feature that everyone is subscribed to, there's a tendency to think about it as like an extended family in which not necessarily every individual, every member of that family subscribes to exactly the same set of essential features, but we still can talk about, so to speak, a family name. And another complexity that has to do with Zionism, and when you read it historically, is that it in a way involves so many multiple contexts. Understanding Zionism is understanding European history, because sources of inspiration are European, because the great majority of the founding figures are European Jews, and they were inspired and they were thinking about European experiences, and they were also responding to the question of the place of Jews in Europe. But at the same time, it's also as a very interesting, and I will try to allude to it very briefly, relationship with the longer genealogy of Jewish history, and even ambivalent dialectic relationship with Jewish theology. And of course, from the minute there are Jewish settlers in Palestine, it is also a part of Middle Eastern history. So in a way, like this, my crude Venn diagram is to say, we need to jump between all these hoops. And of course, not to throw too many big $10 words on the crowd today. The subject is difficult enough. Of course, there are different intellectual and academic paradigms or analytical frames you can use in order to study it. I am trained for good and for bad in that tradition of intellectual history. So I tend to trace history of political ideas. It has its advantages, it has its disadvantages. There's always an accusation that intellectual historians are following the chattering classes, they don't understand the practices on the ground. One can also study Zionism through the perspective of nationalism studies and think about the way in which Zionist thinkers drew their inspiration from other nationalist movements and were involved in nationalist struggles. But of course, settler colonial studies is a valuable and a legitimate approach and a perspective through which practices of Jewish settlement in Palestine are interpreted. And I would add the fourth round, that's kind of my wheelhouse. From World War I onwards, and the previous speaker in the series already alluded to it, there's a big game changer. Palestine is changing hands. The Ottoman Empire is collapsing. There's a new sheriff in town. It's called the British Empire. And pre-1948 Zionism, Zionists can love the British, they can hate the British, but they need to play their cards vis-a-vis the British Empire. So understanding what's going on in Palestine is, I would argue, that's kind of what justifies my paycheck. Is also understanding a chapter of Britain's movement in the Middle East and the intersection between all of these. Now, there's also always kind of the question, so why, if I am interested in Israel, Palestine, and also Palestine before Israel, why should I even understand something about Zionism? And I'm also alluding to a title of a very famous, brilliant essay by the late Edward Said, Zionism from the Standpoint of its Victims. And one also kind of needs to think whether, who cares, right? So one can say from the standpoint of the sheep that is about to be devoured by the lion, the sheep is not really interested in whether the lion, came from that place or from the other place, and whether he brushed its teeth or not, and what were the lion's intentions. At the end of the day, that's a result. But I will want to allude to the fact that, historically speaking, Palestinian activists, thinkers, nationalist movement, national leaders were very much interested in the history of Zionism. And you will, the photo here alludes to it. On the right hand, you will see a very famous anthology, The Zionist Idea. Some of the professors or my colleagues probably are familiar with this. It's an anthology that is still often used as kind of the textbook in history of Zionism classes, taught by, it was assembled by Arthur Hertzberg, was an American rabbi. The Hebrew translation appeared the same year with an Arabic translation. There's a brilliant article on the subject by my colleague Jonathan Grebitz, and the translation came from the PLO's research arm in Beirut. One can say it was from the perspective of I know your enemy, that Palestinians really learned what is, what's in a way, what I'm about to say now is what Palestinian intellectuals and activists were learning. What are the different variations and themes within Zionism? What are the main thinkers and so on? And I would even say that up to 2011, 15, depends on how you count it, even Palestinian political prisoners in Israel were allowed to study with the Israeli Open University. As someone who's involved in writing a revised new textbook on the history of Zionism in Hebrew for the Open University in Israel, I can tell you that up to 2011, Palestinian prisoners and Israeli prisoners were taking the previous version of the class, including Yehia Sinwar, that speaks brilliant Hebrew and understands how Zionism works. So if you want, part of the conflict is in the way, Palestinians know Zionism far better than the Israelis understand the chronicles of Palestinian history. And that's also part of the dynamic here. So let's jump right into the very, very crude and quick, fast-paced history of Zionism and its very early genesis and so on. I would allude very quickly to a terminology that I personally, as an intellectual historian, sometimes steer away from, which is the tendency to talk about thinkers that were operating in Europe in the mid-19th century. Before even the term Zionism was coined, actually, we have a very clear date of birth for the term. It's 1897. Actually, not Herzl himself. He took it from a thinker named Nathan Birnbaum, a Viennese Jew, that later would become the founding father, one of the founding fathers of Agudat Israel, the ultra-Orthodox party. But even before that, there's a tendency to look at some thinkers, both rabbis and secular thinkers, and to call them forerunners of Zionism or precursors of Zionism. The three names that often appear that are mentioned in that respect are Moses Hess, a German Jewish thinker that wrote in the 1860s a book that is called Rome and Jerusalem, wrote in German, Rome and Jerusalem. And as the title alludes to, the inspiration is coming from the Risorgimento, from the Italian nationalist movement. And this is also my way to say, yes, part of the reason people are talking about them as forerunners of nationalism, these are Jews that are seeing nationalist movements happen and taking place in Europe. They're inspired by them. They're responding to them. And in that respect, if you think about Zionism from the perspective of nationalism studies, it is a latecomer if you compare it to nationalist movements elsewhere. And I would even allude quickly to Rabbis Yehuda Alkalai and Tzvi Hirsch-Kalisher. As you can see, I've mentioned their locations in geography, not because it's a geography quiz, just to allude to the fact that both of them, not surprisingly, are living in meeting points, intersections between nationalist movements. So Yehuda Alkalai is working in Sarajevo in the Ottoman Empire. You will hear about the Ottoman Empire from a much bigger expert than myself. And so he sees the Greek War of Independence and the decline of the Ottomans. And Rabbi Kalisher is in Poznan. He's really at the meeting point between Polish and German nationalism. In 1848. So that's one of the reasons that historically, it's not that surprising that they're starting to think about Jews as a nationalist group and so on, even before they were using the term Zionism. But in a way, I would argue, and I'm in good hands and I'm following a good crowd, the early signs of crystallization of a Jewish nationalist movement, they're talking about Jews as a national group, can be found in late imperial Russia, already in the 1870s and 80s. You can see it especially among thinkers and authors. It's very much a movement of intellectuals that are thinking about new Jewish literature. So there's a clear connection between the history of modern Hebrew literature and the beginnings of nationalism. The portrait of Shaul Chernichovsky, the poet, is central. Those of you who heard about Eliezer Ben Yehuda, that is the compiler of the modern Hebrew dictionary, is part of it. And also completely forgotten figures such as Nahum Sluch and so on. And at the same time, you'll have also one of the first pamphlets by Leon Pinsker calling itself Auto-Emancipation, that people see it as preparing the ground for Herzl that will come a decade and a half later to talk about self-emancipation of Jews by themselves, not waiting for emancipation to come from the outside. But how is that connected to the kind of primal first division that you'll see in the beginnings of Zionism? So usually I think that probably most of you heard about the name Theodor Herzl, man known for having the best hipster beard ever in history, a Viennese author, playwright, trained as a lawyer, that of course tried to integrate into a late Habsburg society, was deeply frustrated, and was also had amazing organizational skills. So he created the first Zionist Congress in 1897 and started off that movement. His tract, of course, Jewish State from 1896 was kind of part of what inspired it. And it's often referred to as the key text in political Zionism. Why political? He has a political vision. He's talking about a state. We can talk later on about whether he's talking about state in a lowercase or a lowercase s or a capital S. I will unpack this later on in my talk, hopefully. But he is very much inspired from Central European models of what is a state, but he also assumes that part of what the Jewish state would be established through recognition of international powers. He's talking about some sort of a charter. Sometimes Herzl's practice was simply called by short name charterism, meaning that there will be a recognition from an international power that would allow Jews to settle and start building their own state. And from the onset, he's getting a pushback internally from those Russian Zionists or Russian lovers of Zionism, of Zion. And perhaps their guru figure is the essayist and the author Achad Ha'am, a pen name for Asher Ginsburg. Is basically coming to Herzl and saying, okay, I understand that you have this vision of a state. I can see that you're very much immersed in German type of understanding of what is a state. I don't understand what's Jewish about your state. And it's not because Khadam was a religious figure. Actually, like so many of his peers and of his generation, has this Oedipal tension with the world of his fathers, and he's brushing away religiosity. And he wants to think about Jewishness as a national tribute that will have a cultural element. It has a historical memory, perennial kind of a nationalist attitude. Is very much influenced by Ernst Renan, the famous thinker, French thinker. And in a way, when I'm teaching it to my students, I tell them, if you think about that political Zionism, its aim and goal is a creation of a state, right? So to declare independence like Ben Gurion declared it in 1948, in a way for Echad Ha'am, what would be the institution that symbolizes the achievement? It's an open-ended question, but I will say my alma mater, the Hebrew University. You have an institution of higher learning that combines Jewish studies and Jewish learning, but it's not a modern yeshiva. It is a university, and it also includes in it the modern sciences. It's also a model in which, this would be the revival of a modern secular Jewish identity. And a lot of the followers of Echad Ha'am are actually pushing back. This is an internal opposition for Herzl from day one, and so on. Now, of course, one may ask, so what's the role of religion in all of that? And this picture is actually complicated, and I try to allude to it very briefly in this slide, in which you can see two pictures that in a way are contradictory. On the right hand, in this small screenshot of a famous article, actually a petition in a major German newspaper called Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums, that was one of the main journals, magazines of German Jews. This is a petition of German rabbis that heard that Herzl is about to convene his first Zionist Congress in Munich. And they basically said, in polite German way, over our dead bodies. This is apocryphal. It has nothing to do with Judaism. Almost intimidate, implying that can be a false messiah, and also something that would position them in an awkward position. They see themselves as citizens of Germany, patriotic German citizens, as the model was, the formula of the time, German citizens of the Mosaic faith. And this Herzl is a troublemaker. By the way, this is the reason why the first Zionist Congress is taking place in a ballroom in Basel, Switzerland, and not in Germany. That's exactly the letter. So there's a pushback that coming from there. At the same time, once the Zionist movement is trying to start its campaign of hearts and minds and want to attract the masses, and the masses in Eastern Europe are religious folks, of course, it translates itself to the vernacular of religious Jews. So what you see in the bigger picture is a Simchat Torah, the Jewish festival flag, in which you see portraits of two anti-clerical figures, basically, Max Nordau and Herzl. Nordau was Herzl's right-hand man, but they are presented in a setting which in itself is very religious, in a religious context and so on. So this dialectic is there from day one, and I can allude to it later on. This said, and just to finish my last point, part of the tension that early Zionism runs through early Zionism, it has to do also with internal tensions within European Jewry that we tend to forget today. Nowadays, we think about Ashkenazi Jews as one big, assembly. It's a cabinet, a basket in which we throw into it so numerous different groups. If you're late 19th century, early 20th century European Jew, the term Ashkenazi refers only to German-speaking Jews, and German-speaking Jews are looking down at these half-barbarous backwater Jews of Eastern Europe that are not enjoying. They're not citizens. They're subject in the Pale of Settlements. They're not enjoying the benefits of emancipation in Western societies, and so on. So Zionism early on also mapped onto these internal schisms within the Jewish world. Nevertheless, if you think about the early settlements that are already done through within the Zionist impetus, I mean, again, there were pre-existing communities of Jews in Palestine, and you will see the first settlers that are calling themselves Zionists, and this is what later on would be called the first Aliyah. When you see the first colonies, only 7 colonies that were able successfully to build, these divisions between political and Zionism and cultural Zionism are in a way secondary. A lot of what is happening in those early years falls under the rubric of what was then called practical Zionism, which is a mix of several things. There were a lot of German know-how, German Jews that were sociologists, demographers, expert on colonial practices to the level of, I've mentioned here the name of Otto Warburg from the famous Warburg family. He's a botanist, and he's interested in questions about what type of crops will be the best to be, to be harvested so that the colony will be self-sustaining economically, which is a classic colonial, question. And Arthur Rupin, to whom I will allude later on, there's a bit of a philanthropy coming from the English branch of the Rothschild in the first colonies. And there's also something that may sound odd to contemporary ears, which is a love-hate relationship of those first colonists with the Oriental societies to which they are coming to. And if you don't believe me, just look at the portraits of those first members of the first Aliyah that were members of the group calling itself Hashomer. These are East European Jews, Romanian and Russian Jews predominantly, dressed as the local Arabs or Bedouins or Cherkessi guards, trying to learn from them not only how to dress, but also how to work the fields and how to guard the fields, how to ride a horse. And this is from the book anthology in memory of those Shomrim that came out later on. So in today's parlance, that would be seen to us as a very vulgar kind of cultural appropriation, but there's a lot of interesting discussions about the way these early settlers had this kind of a love-hate relationship with saying, part of what we're doing is trying to learn how to behave in this new climate and environment and so on. And some excellent work were done about processes of later on disenchantment. So they're like an early phase of enchantment by the zone and then distancing yourself from your neighbors. And also from the very early stage, you will have first voices. Don't want to overstate my argument. It's not the masses, but you will have already first criticisms of Zionists are saying, something is going wrong here in the relationship that these settlers have with their neighbors. So it would come even from Echad Ha'am himself that had a famous visit to Palestine in the early 1890s that culminated in a series of articles called Emet Me'eretz Yisrael, Truth from Eretz Yisrael, that is very much criticizing the first settlers for their way in which they're looking down at the Palestinian natives, and famously argues that the basic principle upon which all rests will be not the quantity of the actions of the Zionists, but their quality. And also less known, but now oft-quoted speech by Yitzhak Epstein. You can find it online. The hidden question, yes, the allusion here is to the Jewish question, the Judenfrage, and he's trying to say, yes, by attempting to solve the Jewish question, there's like a new question that arises here, and it's, in today's parlance, the elephant in the room. We need to talk about the hidden question, which is the Palestinian question that emerges. Of course, they're not using the term Palestinian at the time, they're calling them Arabs, but the relations, they're there. They're like these first light bulbs, red flashing light bulbs are there from the beginning. But I've mentioned the fact that there's a lot of know-how, and already from 1904, so we're still, in terms of the timeline, late Ottoman Empire, we're still before the World War I, you will see first kind of attempts to come with like a central organization and a planning system for the purchases of lands in Palestine. Perhaps one of the most important figures in that respect is Dr. Arthur Rupin, that headed the Zionist, the Eretz Israeli Bureau, Hamisrad Eretz Israeli, that was established in Jaffa in 1909. And part of the idea was that he had a vision of there should be a pattern to purchase the lands. It's not simply a land grab wherever you can find it. There will be a system, as you can see from the map here, follow the darker phases. This is what was often referred to as the N shape of the map. So you see purchasing land along the coastal plain on the Mediterranean, all the way up to the Gulf of Haifa, the Haifa port, and then going into Ibn al-Amr, that they will be called in Hebrew today, Emek Yisrael. So these are fertile valleys of the lower Galilee, all the way up to Lake Kinneret, and then along the north. So it kind of if you connect the dots, it looks a bit like an N. So some people refer to it sometimes as an N shape. And very, very few exceptions attempt to purchase lands in what we will call today the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Jerusalem is a bit of an exception, but so the idea of a very agricultural kind of a setting of colonies, but also port cities that would allow those settlers to sell it, and of course involvement of diaspora communities through the mechanism of the Jewish National Fund, raising money for purchasing these lands. Now, as this is happening, these first Zionists are definitely not the most successful showing now. And actually, part of what we need to understand, I mean, historically is super important, is also not to equate the term Jewish nationalism with Zionism. So not only that within Zionism, you have these different internal disputes and branches, Zionism is only one form of a political movement that started saying Jews are a national group, not only a religious sect, or something that is beyond a religious sect, and we need to think about a political solution to their communal national existence. And actually, if you want to understand the chronicles of Zionism, early Zionism properly, you need to understand it's always a dialogue and sometimes a competition with these other forms of Jewish nationalism. And perhaps the three main contenders or the three competitions are the ones that I am alluding to in this graph. One is the term is diaspora nationalism that is promoted by the historian Simon Dubnov, that is starting to write a series of articles exactly the same year that Herzl is writing, is assembling his first Zionist Congress in 1897, that is talking about some sort of an autonomy. The Jews will have self-governance in a type of an autonomy, but without immigrating. So remember that we're talking about the late 19th century and we're talking about predominantly Russian Jews. So this is where the East, when Russian Jews are starting to immigrate in masses to westwards, the great majority to here, to the US and to other Western countries, the Zionist immigration is actually a tiny, tiny trickle out of this huge tsunami of immigrants. And those East European nationalists are saying, no, we need to find a way for Jews to remain as they are, reimagine their existence and talk about their existence as a national group within what they hoped would become a modernized, reformed Russia that will be more democratic and will allow multiple nationalities to represent themselves. This is why, for instance, 1905, which is a revolution that turns the Russian Empire into a constitutional monarchy with parties, is for them, oh, the Messiah is coming. But 10 years later, something else happens and these dreams are ending. So autonomism is actually a very important contender, and Chada'am and Dubnov are rubbing shoulders, quite literally. They're in this, they're even like marriage connections between their families, but they disagree on the principal things. They both agree that Jews are a national group, but they disagree on other elements. But perhaps the much more important, and definitely in terms of scale and size is much more significant, is the group calling itself the Bund. It's actually a party of Marxists and nationalists. Yes, I know it sounds like an oxymoron, a combination of things that can be irreconcilable, but this is the difference between political theory and history. People can mix different ideas together. And they are also East European predominantly thinkers that are very much influenced by a famous rabbi that you can see in the center of that piece. Is called Karl Marx. And they are talking about the importance of supporting the role of the Jewish worker, the working class, that is suffering from double oppression, both as a working class. So it's both a struggle that is a Marxist struggle and struggling as a Jew due to prejudice and discrimination. Of course, the hardcore Bolsheviks could not stand the Bund. Plekhanov famously called them Zionists with seasickness. So it's sort of, you are actually keeping your closet Zionists, but you just don't want to immigrate, which they found very offensive. But it's a very important chapter, not only in the history of Zionism, but also in the history of pre-revolutionary Russia. But the third group is not less important, which is the territorialists. The territorialists is a group that really emerged from within the Herzlian Zionism. And its crowning figure was the English playwright, author, essayist Israel Zangwill, whose portrait you can see here. Israel Zangwill was a huge fan of Herzl, in a way, one of the very few British Jews that took Herzl's ideas seriously. And as probably some of you know very well, Herzl was thinking about a Jewish state, but it didn't necessarily say it should be only in the Promised Land or in Palestine. Even in his 1896 pamphlet, he's talking about this, or maybe Argentina, because we're like, in 1904, to make a long story short, the Zionist movement is receiving an offer they can't refuse, but it did refuse, from the British government that is very interested in sending settlers to East Africa, to West Africa, to an areas that it's a bit of a misnomer, but we call Uganda. It's more Kenya today. And the Uganda proposal is coming to the doorstep of the Zionists, and they need to decide where's the Jewish state. Right, so Zionists are fighting fiercely about it between those who are saying, how can you think about Zionism without Zion? Zion is a different name for Jerusalem. And others are saying, no, Zionism is a refuge, is a shelter for persecuted Jewish refugees. If they're offering us a different territory, we should go there. And this is the position of Israel Zangwill. And the minute that the official Zionist Congress is saying, no, Zionism is only about Jerusalem, he's creating a splinter group calling itself the ITO, the Jewish Territorial Organization. It's simply in Yiddish, it works as ITO. It's not my spelling mistake. And they are continuing to search for a land where Jews could immigrate to and create their own state. So sort of he sees himself, we would call him today as sort of someone who's breaking away from Zionism. And in traditional textbook, he will be seen as the nemesis of Zionism. But actually, historically, he actually sees himself as the most Herzlian thinker ever, and thinks that the Zionist movement was hijacked by these weird religious Russian Jews that cannot imagine a state only in a different place like Jerusalem. He's super important because a lot of the slogans that are very problematic are actually coming from these British thinkers. So I think that probably many of you heard the slogan, people without a country looking for a country without a land, people without a land looking for a land without a people. This is today is seen as a key Zionist slogan. It's actually a slogan coming from Lord Shaftesbury, who's a late, Victorian restorative theologian. And then Zangwill is the one using it when he's searching for a land either in other places, and continued in Northern Africa and so on, for Jewish settlement. And just as an anecdote, but it's a very telling anecdote, there's one very important textbook on the history of Zionism that talks about 5 founding fathers of Zionism that includes Zionism in it. The author of that book is Ben Zion Netanyahu. the father of Benjamin Netanyahu. So for him, Zangwill's emphasis on creating a state and creating it in a space where you will create a Jewish majority is, for him, as important as any type of Zionist ideology. So it's something to be heard of. I will talk very, very briefly about perhaps the other splintering groups between labor Zionism, revisionist Zionism, and religious Zionism. And labor Zionism has its own history. I will allude to the fact that the great majority of the classic textbooks are written, if they're written by Israeli historians, predominantly by people that are coming from within the labor Zionist movement. So this is why for North American readers, sometimes it would look like inside baseball, because a lot of the textbook wants to show why the other branches of Zionism are dead wrong. So it's a bit of a party politics. And labor Zionism itself is a kind of a interesting mix of different ideas. There were some labor Zionists that were inspired by Tolstoy. Aaron David Gordon is, for me, a Jewish Tolstoyan figure. He's alienated by modern society and the big cities, and he wants men to go back to nature and work the land and to be connected with their physicality and so on and so forth. And in his 90s is plowing the field. So that's kind of the image of labor Zionism he's coming from, and he's not really a Marxist in thinking about revolution. And others like Be'er Bochov, who's a hardcore Marxist, and he thinks about the revolution, and he's talking about the need to create a massive Jewish proletariat that will create a revolution, and so on. So under the rubric of labor Zionism, we find numerous of these ideas. But what is important is that very early on, the settlers that are coming from the labor Zionist movement are establishing the first parties. That parties have their own newspapers, they have their own establishment, and very quickly on, they are the dominant group on the ground. Predominantly, many of them, you won't be surprised to hear, are not exactly religious. They even have a very strong anti-clerical element in many of them. But at the same time, you will start seeing the first origins of what we would call religious Zionism. And the gentleman you see here, Rabbi Yitzhak Avraham Kook, is important in that respect. When Herzl dies, he moves to Palestine to become a rabbi in Jaffa in 1904, the exact same year that Herzl dies. And one of the first things he does is a very famous sermon in memory of Herzl, in which he starts looking at the Zionist movement through a messianic language and starts talking in the sermon in memory of Herzl about the birth pang of the Messiah. And he's doing something that for the Jewish theology folks in the room is a huge leap, because he needs to find a very interesting, and there's a lot of interesting intellectual acrobatics that one needs to do in order to move in that direction. I can allude to it in greater detail in the Q&A. And as those of you who can read the excerpt, you can see that he's not calling him the main Messiah, it's the Messiah. There's a smaller Messiah that will prepare the ground to the bigger Messiah. So he's thinking about it as a process. I don't want to be. There's a tendency to present this through a vulgar schema that's saying they are automatic. These religious Zionists are already seeing these settlers as the vehicles of the Messiah. So they are willing to turn a blind eye to the fact that these settlers are not keeping kosher and not keeping Sabbath and not, but they are the engine of the Messiah, or as it's sometimes referred to, the donkey on which the Messiah will come. According to the prophecies, so they're looking at the settlers as that donkey. It's a bit of a simplification, but for the sake of our argument today, it helps. So again, though labor Zionist in its core is actually anti-clerical in many respects, there is something of dialectics that is there from the early beginnings, with thanks to the writings of Rabbi Avraham Kook, and who will become a recurring figure, and we'll mention his son later on. But part of what is happening, and again, I alluded to the fact that World War I is a game changer. Part of what is happening after World War I is very interesting in the following sense. You'll have even further fractioning within the Zionist movement with the rise of revisionist Zionism that I will allude to in a second. That sets itself as really an alternative, different organization that has its own group. Its founding figure is Odessa-based author, essayist, translator by the name of Vladimir Jabotinsky. He lives in Palestine for a very short time and then expelled by the British. Is much more hawkish, much more militant. And because I mentioned the fact that he's expelled from Palestine, because from that moment on, he will be sitting in European capitals, Paris predominantly, writing in European languages, in Russian, in French and Italian and so on. And his base, to use contemporary parlance, are predominantly East European Jews. The movement, the youth movement, Beitar, which is the revisionist youth movement, more than half of the Beitar camps were in interwar Poland. This is where he's gaining his from. While in Palestine itself, Ben Gurion is, in a way, thanks to the history route, is the one calling the shots and so on. But at the same time, there's an empire, and the nerve system, in a way, is not Palestine. It's London. And the guy pulling the shots in London and the one that has access to quarters of power is this gentleman, Chaim Weizmann. Now, Chaim Weizmann is a chemist, and therefore he likes to call his Zionism synthetic Zionism. How appropriate. But there's also something appropriate about this terminology, because he started his career as an Chadamist. I'm one of the people, I'm an East European Jew. I can speak Yiddish. I'm coming from this kind of a poor family in the shtetl. And he really started as one of the fierce opposition to Herzl as a young lad. But I succeeded exactly where Herzl failed. Remember, I alluded to charterism and the idea that the Zionists will not come as thieves in the night, as Arthur Kessler called it, but will have a recognition and a power that grants them the permission. And here I have it. This is the Balfour Declaration of 1917. And hence I was able to do exactly what Herzl failed to do. Here's a new rising power, the British Empire, is looking favorably at the creation of a Jewish home, national home in Palestine. And this will become a small letter that will gain political muscle from that moment on, as the Zionists will start interpreting it in a way that justifies it. It's actually a masterpiece of a document that is very nebulous, that is not saying anything explicit. It's not mentioning the word state or colony or protectorate. It talks, its Majesty's government is looking at a favorable eye at the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. I know there's political scientists in the room, so I know what's a republic, I know what's a state. What's a national home? Unclear. It's a national home in Palestine. It's not of entire Palestine. So what is it? You know, if you have two high-risers in Tel Aviv and you put a lot of Jews in it, that's a Jewish national home? Maybe. I don't know. Is it the entire Palestine? No. So it's a text that was carefully crafted by the British to say nothing in so many words, but it will gain importance as it will be interpreted later on. It will get into the League of Nations mandate on Palestine, and later on into the UN resolutions and even the Israeli independence Declaration of Independence. And I cannot emphasize more. I cannot say how important it is to understand that from that moment on, it's a different game set. The ones calling the shot are the British. Palestine becomes part of an empire. Yes, it's not formally a colony. It's a mandate that is governed through a high commissioner and so on. But even the borders of what we call Palestine are set by the British. Again, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not arguing, God forbid, there's no Palestinian nation. I'm not arguing that the name Palestine did not exist before that. But when we imagine that entity that we are calling today between river and the sea, that's carving out of Palestine in Churchill's white paper of 1921 to separate it from Transjordan that we know today as the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So even the borders, the geographical entity that would be governed as Palestine, that in English will be called Palestine, and the Zionists will call Palestina Eretz Israel, this long hyphenated name, is a British invention, and they are central to that task. This is a fantastic caricature that I found in the Punch magazine. Is very famous for its wonderful political cartoons, and this is Churchill coming back after the 1921 Cairo conference in Cairo. No Zionists there, in which basically was carving out the borders of Iraq, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and so on, trying to figure out what the British will do with all the different promises they gave to different groups on the ground as part of their wartime policies. And a famous true story, there were a cub of lions that was given to Churchill during that conference by one of the British colonial officers that Churchill brought back with him to the London Zoo. So this is why this cartoon alludes to these two cubs. And the two cubs, those of you who can't read the fine print, are named Palestine and Mesopotamia, today's Iraq. And he's coming back to Britain, to London, and the British are saying, yes, I'm afraid, Winston, they'll be very expensive to wear, right? It's going to be very difficult, this experiment that you're thinking about. And I can go on into that in great detail. But think about the situation now in Zionism after 1917. Actually, one of the questions one needs to ask, so where's the headquarters? Who's calling the shot? And in a way, I would argue the following. It is part of an empire. So Weizmann's headquarters in 77 Great Russell Street, Google it on map, you'll see it's really prime location, really close to British Museum, is far more important than what's happening in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and definitely all those settlements in rural Palestine. But at the same time, the one calling the shots on the ground is David Ben-Gurion. In a way, David Ben-Gurion, up to the end of World War II, is eclipsed by Chaim Weizmann. There's a lot of waiting for that opportunity that will push back Weizmann. And Ben-Gurion is gaining power through the Labor Party's kind of a mechanism, through the settlements such as the communal settlements, the kibbutzim and the moshavim, and through the Histadrut, which is basically a huge trade union, and so on and so forth. At the same time, you have right-wing revisionist Zionists that are following Jabotinsky. This is the precursor of today's Likud party, but many of them are Russian Jews reading a newspaper called Razviet that is coming out in Russian from Paris, or Polish Jews there, and so on, and the beginning of religious Zionism. So it's a very kind of a weird situation. To make things even, to use another historical analogy, and yes, it might sound provocative, but I'm provocative here on purpose. Those of you who are familiar with the chronicles of the First Intifada that broke out in 1987 know very well that it started as a grassroots movement from Gaza and the West Bank, predominantly from Gaza, while the PLO headquarters were way far away in Tunis. So in a way, this duality of headquarters far away and reality of the ground, that's the part of the dynamic in mandatory Palestine. So it's, Weizmann is traveling back and forth often, but this is kind of part of the dynamic you see during that period. And this is very important to the chronicles of the paramilitary groups, because each one of those groups will have its own paramilitary groups. I don't want to go into great detail into that, but I just want to mention some things that people tend to be confused about. A lot of the paramilitary groups that are emerging from the labor Zionists, not only that they're not illegal, they're not underground, with the blessing of the British mandatory forces. They want the locals to govern themselves and to police themselves. And when World War II breaks out and Rommel troops, the Wehrmacht is in Northern Africa, and there's a fear that Palestine will be invaded, the British are saying, let's create a striking force that they call Palmach, that is established in, special sabotage and special operations as part of preparation of a possible invasion. Yes, and then El Alamein happens, and Palmachar saying, no, we're not going home, we're staying. But these are like the nucleus of the IDF and the main powers when the 1948 war will break out. And I know Shaikh Hasqani will speak to you, so there's much more he can tell you about that, which is a completely different story from the paramilitary groups that are emerging from within the revisionist Zionist groups. The Etzel, the first one, it's an acronym for Irgun Tzva'i Leumi, national military organization, with its emblem that speaks for itself, the greater land of Israel. They don't recognize the first 1921 division of Palestine between Transjordan and Jordan. The greater land of Israel for them includes the territories of today's Jordan, and it would not be occupied, it would not be acquired through a gesture or a charter, but occupied through power of military. So in a way, the emblem speaks exactly to what they think. In terms of numbers, they're smaller, significantly smaller, but they're much more hawkish and militarist. And from there, you have even the other splinter group, Lehi, or the Stern Gang, as the British are calling them, and they are openly, sabotaging British facilities and Arab communities. So if you will see in some quarters of the Israeli right, people that are saying, hey, we are ourselves anti-colonial fighters, we were fighting the British, that's coming from that side of the right. Menachem Begin, for him, it was part of Western hypocrisy. I was fighting the British. In the case of Menachem Begin, I and my five buddies are the reason the entire British Empire collapsed. Yeah, but that's Menachem Begin. Yeah, a very Polish imagination. But that's kind of their self-understanding and conception. I will rush right on. So why all of that is important after 1948? And this is really where I'll wrap it very quickly. So part of the question is whether this long conversation about how Zionism was fractured into different branches, is it even relevant to the realities after the Nakba and after 1948? So of course, in the war of 1948, that technically starts in 1947 with the partition resolution in the UN, changes the reality on the ground radically. Something that starts as a war of partition. I have an article that argues we need to rethink about the war of 1948 as a war of partition. And of course, once the demography changes radically, 750,000 Palestinians are fleeing their homes or expelled and cannot return. That's the important part. It's not only what happens in the war, but the way you create laws that prevent them from returning, and at the same time, mass Jewish immigration. So the demography is changing radically. Palestinians become a minority in their own home. So of course, a lot of it changes. So are these fractions important to understand what happens in Israel after 1948? And one can even argue, why should we even call, is Zionism is an irrelevant term after 1948? So as always, the answer is yes and no. In some respects, these fractions and internal divisions continue reproducing themselves. In other dimensions, they are actually become completely irrelevant and demolished. So in what respect? Where they are reproduced? Definitely they're reproduced in the parties. So the way in which Israel is governed by the Labour Party, Mapai, Ben-Gurion's party, all the way up to 1977, of course, connected to the dynamics I just alluded to earlier on. And they're running the show until 1977, which is striking similarity to the Indian Congress Party in Gandhi's party in India. So the same main force that galvanized, that brought India to independence will continue running the parliamentary politics exactly 1977. It's almost, the dates are strikingly similar, and I don't want to go into that. And the Herut party, which is the forerunner of today's Likud, is actually the party of the veterans of those paramilitaries. And if you look, these are not photos of Menachem Begin as an underground secret terror group, but as someone who reinvents himself as a politician. and the head of the opposition, but his party is called Cherut, which is freedom or liberty in Hebrew, and he calls upon the veterans of those of the Etzel and Lehi to join him. And of course, it's very important for him that always it will be a Jabotinsky portrait at the background. It was very important for him to present himself as the heir to Jabotinsky. And of course, you see that the emblems are continuing. So in a way, this is where it reproduces itself very clearly, and the fractions are very clear in political debates between the Labour Party and the Likud. This said, I wouldn't fetishize it too much. And there are places in which it starts demolishing. And one of the places is perhaps Israeli militarism. The one-eyed general, Moshe Dayan, that probably many of you recognize, his portrait is a good example. Sociologically and ideologically is coming from not simply the labor Zionists, is coming from one of the Kennedy families of the labor Zionist movement. This is really he's growing up in Nahalal, which is like the poster image of a labor Zionist as a man. But as a general, actually the type of ideology that he starts producing is surprisingly similar to Jabotinsky's Iron Wall. So in the context of Israel's early wars in the 1950s, I think that some of the divisions that we tend to almost fetishize about revisionism versus labor Zionism become questionable. And I can allude to it, but shamelessly, I'll plug in a podcast recording I made just a couple of weeks ago under the auspices of the Association of Jewish Studies. They asked several scholars to choose a text and talk about it, and why do you think it's relevant today? And I chose a very famous speech that Dayan gave in 1956 about in memory of Ro'i Rothberg, that was murdered in Nachal Oz, exactly one of those kibbutzim that was attacked on October 7. So we're returning exactly the same scene, and the ideas that he's expressing there perhaps may sound very surprising to contemporary ears. Where you also see that's alluding is after 1967. With the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, and you have a greater a movement calling for a greater Israel, you will have type of coalitions and combinations that are unheard of in pre-1948. So you'll have to believe me that if you look at the portraits of the gentlemen in the room, in this painting, yes, there are no ladies in the Greater Land of Israel movement, but you have there things that would sound very odd. Ultra, very religious figures and ultra anti-clerical figures, people that were coming originally from labor Zionist, even Marxist parts of Zionism, and those who are revisionist, hardcore revisionist thinkers. And this is where the 1967 war does change a lot with the rise of Gush Emunim. And I will end here that sort of the settler movement that is emerging after 1967 is really where religious Zionism that was there. I was not saying that it was invented out of nowhere, but really comes to the forefront. And surprising as it may sound, it would be exactly the son of the same Rabbi Kook, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who would become the kind of a guru, the mentor of Gush Emunim, the most religious, the religious settler movement. Gush Emunim literally means block of the faithful, that are calling to resettle the West Bank and Gaza. And his speeches and sermons at the eve of 1967, the 1967 war, will be interpreted by his followers almost as prophecies. And the triumph of Israel in 1967 will be seen as the Messiah coming in. So that's kind of where things, history is both informative, but I also hope that I explained to you that you shouldn't over fetishize it and pull into kind of there's a tendency in Zionism to write a very party type of politics that overemphasizes the differences, hence alluding back to the metaphor of family resemblance. So I threw much more than I need at you. Again, I apologize. I had to squeeze into a limited time when I have an entire semester to unpack with my students. So I'll be very happy to open it up to questions.
Moderate.
Absolutely.
So two quick announcements before we turn it over to Q&A. One, just to say that we gave Professor Dubnov a pretty impossible task, which is to cover a huge amount of material in a short period of time, and he has pulled it off, I think, with aplomb. So thank you for a very rich, very complex, lots of food for thought, and I hope that we'll have time to unpack it during the Q&A for those who have specific questions. I'll also just put in a plug, once again, for the QR code on the back of the flyers that you have on your seats. As we continue to work on this series to plan future programming, feedback that people are able to provide to us would be enormously helpful. So please, if you're able to, that would be great. I'll moderate Q&A, and then there are going to be people circulating with microphones. So if you can just wait after you're called on until you have a microphone in your hand, so we can pick you up on the recording. And with that, the floor is open. Please.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. So I'm coming here straight from a class on fascism, where we were discussing paramilitary groups in opposition to each other in Germany around the same time as the paramilitary groups you were just mentioning in Israel. And I was wondering if you could, or if there is a connection between the two, if they're in a way of reflection or in response to each other.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? I should probably speak in Nick. Yeah, thank you. Fun stuff, right? Yeah, they were Jews that like leather boots as well. So to make within the revisionist movement, you will have in the 1930s a very strong, process of radicalization to the right, and within the movement, you will definitely see people that are openly saying that they are following the example of Benito Mussolini, and including Abba Achimeir, who was a very prominent thinker that had even a column in their journal that is called Yomano shel Fascistan, the diary of a fascist. And it sounds horrible to contemporary ears, but this is a period in which they looked at Benito Mussolini as it was very important for them to distinguish between Hitler and Mussolini, so that we have nothing to do with these weird, crazy Marxist revolutionaries. We're here about building a nation. Ben-Gurion and his friends are mixing it with crazy socialist ideas. We want a strong state. We want a centralized state. Benito Mussolini is a model. There even were calling upon Jabotinsky to declare himself a dictator or El Duce. I had the pleasure of working with a phenomenal Italian MA student that read the Italian sources. So there is a stage in which the Vital movement is starting to gravitate more and more toward fascist Italy, and even openly calling itself fascist. This said, I will say that something important needs to be remembered here, that has less to do with what the revisionists are trying to do, but what happens in Italy in 1938. Mussolini didn't get the memo, and he passed a law that, equated its fascist Italy with Germany and its racial discrimination. So all their big ideas that fascist Italy is so different from Nazi Germany are collapsing very quickly in front of their eyes, and they can't continue doing this. Part of my argument is that you won't find it surprising that the language of revolution and violent revolution that they're looking for, then they need to find a different source, and they find it among the Irish. And suddenly they start saying, we are the Sinn Féin. We are like the Irish fighting the British. And you will have speeches of Begin preparing them for his men that are captured by the British, telling the British judges, we saw what you tried to do in Ireland, and you won't be able to do it in Palestine, and so on. So definitely that's part of the language of the 30s. The 30s is a period of rising authoritarianism, and definitely Jews were not immune to that as well. Thank you.
Let's go right to the front, please.
Thank you. Is there a Zionist doctrine? That's my first question. And how does Zionism look today in?
Right. Well, $2 million questions, I guess. And with the U.S. support to Israel, it's more than million. So to start with your first question, I think that if there's a Zionist doctrine, part of what I will try to argue is no, that's actually a weird and slightly ahistorical way of reading Zionism. This doesn't mean that Zionist thinkers, activists were not saying there's, here's a list of principles, sign your name, you're part of the church. But this is not historically the right way of reading it. It's actually about these different division branches. Now, of course, it begs the question, your second question, so what is the meaning of Zionism after 1948, or what is kind of a, and of course, for me as a historian, it's a very complicated story because there's question of whether I am using it as an analytical category to say, here's our trends and groups and ideas, and I, as a historian, as an academic, will call them Zionists or will tag them, and how the historical actors call themselves. I think that in a way, much more fruitful would be to see how people within Israel are using Zionism often as part of an internal domestic fight between right and left, between religious and secular, and along the different fraction lines that are sociological, ideological, political, within Israel, accusing each other that they forgot what Zionism is. So you will have my good latte drinking friends in Tel Aviv that will say, these religious Zionists, they're not really Zionists, they're crazy fanatics, and they hijack the movement. And real Zionism is liberal. You have the settlers that are looking at the latte drinking Tel Avivians are saying, yeah, they forgot what it means to be you need to settle, that's the meaning of Zionism. And so it's a bit of an open-ended question that is part of the dynamic of how people are using it on the ground. So you'll have things that are a lot of internal domestic debates that would sound, for a good reason, odd and even absurd for an external ear, right? So sort of people that say, I can't imagine my future outside Israel. I want to see Israel prosper, but I'm not Zionist. No, I'm post-Zionist, or you would rarely call themselves anti-Zionist, but they will say, even post-Zionism as in a literal sense, that we moved on, we moved to the next phase. Zionism fulfilled its aim and so on. Of course, when it comes to the Israeli political scene and the cuckoo's nest called the Israeli parliament, of course, that's the hot debate, right? Calling someone you're not Zionist, and it will be very difficult for someone to gain a place at the podium, with exception to ultra-Orthodox, by openly saying, I'm not Zionist or an anti-Zionist. You have Palestinian parliamentary members of the parliament saying, I'm not part of that. Yeah, I need to do this. But of course, with very few exceptions, rarely they will be members of the coalition, right? They will be usually in the opposition. So in a way, I didn't answer your question because it's an open-ended question, right? There's a big question about how we use and abuse the term Zionism today. And all these terms assume that you can reduce it to one core idea, which actually mismatch the complexity, the chaotic history of that movement.
Next question is over to the right.
Oh.
Thank you for the presentation. And I'm just thank you for the question, and I'm sorry, thank you for the presentation. And just related to the previous question, I'm just wondering, so what is the notion of race inside Zionism and among Zionists, and how does the current political scenes in Israel reflect that?
So I kind of half heard your question, and I apologize for that. But if you if I definitely got the last part about contemporary politics in Israel.
She asked about race in the.
Oh, about race.
The role of race in Zionism.
Right.
So the previous party, what is the notion of race inside Zionism and among Zionist leaders? And what does and how does the current scene in Israel?
What's the current scene in terms of that? Yeah, thank you. So the two key points that again I could not haven't had the time to allude to. If you remember when I mentioned the name Max Nordau in that slide of the Simchat Torah flag, Max Nordau was a late 19th century, early 20th century thinker that was very much influenced by racial theories of the time. Yeah, was an author of numerous books. One of the most infamous ones is Degeneration. So we're thinking about along the lines of ideas of fathers of what we would call today the science of criminology and even eugenics. And there was an element in them that was thinking about the way in which Jewish nationalism also is responding to a crisis of modernity. And in modern times, you have almost a biological degeneration of the modern. Usually in their books, it's the modern man living in an urban society, and his ideas about creating, a muscular Judaism, the idea of the Maccabea, the Jewish Olympiad is connected to. They're going to go back to the glories of the past, and the Jews would reconnect with their bodies and will be fierce and proud and physical. Was not divorced from racial theories theories at the time, but at the same time, of course, this is part of the very complicated paradoxical of, if we would have had this lecture in Germany, I would have to say dialectical relationship with racism, that Jews are both the the subject of it, and the object of it. In Israel today, you will have and I think Mayan will speak about it much better than I do. You will have a lot of conversations about intra-Jewish divisions that are falling along racial categories. So you will have a very strong conversations about the division, intra-Jewish division between Jews that are coming from European background that often looked down at Jews, MENA Jews from Middle Eastern and North African origins, that they started looking at them as Oriental, and that it also translated itself to early statehood discriminatory policies, even simply at the level of pushing a lot of those immigrants to more peripheral areas and so on and so forth. And I'm sure you will hear about it much more. If it plays a very important role in Israel today, it's actually one of the reasons that the Likud party is very attractive to a lot to many Mizrahi voters. The Likud party historically, it didn't start with Bibi Netanyahu, it starts all the way with Menachem Begin, was very good at coming to Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews and saying the Labor Party is racist towards you, thence vote for us. And the ability to reproduce it time and again in Israeli politics is quite staggering, notwithstanding the fact that always the one in the top of the party in the Likud is still an Ashkenazi. And you will see among Mizrahi intellectuals, Jews that have traced their ancestry to Middle Eastern and North African origins, a lot of conversations about the way in which they hoped to be a bridge to the Palestinians. They saw themselves as Oriental and Arab in their culture, in their diet. We just lost, so to speak. Sami Michael was an Iraqi Jewish author. That was his life project. I'm a Jew from Iraq. Arabic is not alien to me. It's not the language of the enemy. and it was coupled with his Marxist convictions. So you will see among some Mizrahi intellectuals also a very crude anti-Zionist criticism, saying Zionism was so dominated by European thinkers that the victims are not only the non-Jews and the Palestinians, it's also the Jews that came from non-European countries. So that's very, that's very much still in the air and a key a subject of conversation and debate in Israel today.
Another question here in the front row.
This is a lot to digest. Just one interesting point is about also the parallels between India and Israel. It seems like the Zionists were also Indian parallel with the Hindu right wing currently. It's also reading the similar Italian nationalists. Coming to my question, so there seems to be a lot happening in London as the same time. And how do we reconcile that with the Britain voting in 1948 to abstain voting from the partition, given all these promises and all these things happening?
Very softball. It's a super simple question. No, excellent question. And actually the comparison with India is fascinating, both because it alludes to a lot of similarity, but also when it's a different story, it highlights the differences. So I will start actually with this. I mean, today, India under Modi and Israel under Bibi Netanyahu, wow, that's a love story. Actually, Modi came to Israel. Bibi Netanyahu didn't meet him with a suit and a tie. They went like two lovers on the beach of Tel Aviv, on the seashores. It's like almost like wedding photo shoots of them going into the horizon. But historically speaking, it's really surprising because India in 1947 voted against partition, and for many years was seen as the almost arch nemesis, right? And it has to do with Cold War politics and in what was then called the Third World, today we will call the Global South. So to make a long story short, when it comes to India and Israel, in the 1950s, when you have the early statehood years are fascinating in that respect. You have to remember that when Israel is established in 1948, it's still unclear for the first few years where it falls on the East versus West Cold War division. Especially remember, because the labor Zionists are Russian, and so a lot of Western powers are saying, "Oh my goodness, that will be another Soviet satellite kind of." All this, Avi Shlaim would argue that already by 1953, when the U.S. War in Korea, it's already clear for Ben-Gurion that you need to gamble on the Western American side. It's very clear by the Suez Crisis of 1956. And then you have a very odd division that India and Egypt want to see themselves as the leaders of the Global South, what then was called the Third World. The term Third World is coined in 1952. And Israel suddenly finds itself as representing the imperialist West. So it's very important to highlight the fact that this is a 1950s Cold War division. And yours humbly can tell you that in 1947, just a minute before, Jawaharlal Nehru has a wonderful conference that is called the All Asian Conference in New Delhi, invites representatives of all the Eastern Asian nationalist groups that are now shaking off the colonial regimes. And guess what? There's a delegation from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem there. So that was like, I argue in that argument, last moment that it was imaginable that Zionism is actually part of that wave of decolonization. And by the Bandung conference in the early 50s, it's already unthinkable. And that's really where it closes. And it's not that the conference there was without contentions. And so you're right. So India and pre-47 India, the Indian Raj and mandatory Palestine, there's a lot of similarity. Of course, you cannot compare the scales, but you won't find it surprising that Zionists are following events in India closely, despite the fact that it's at the other side of the world, and vice versa. Even though Palestine is a tiny place, Indian and Muslim nationalists in India are looking at what's happening in Palestine as a laboratory. What the British are doing there, we might be next in line. So that's a very important reminder that the historical actors, unlike us, are much more open and minded, and they're not as parochial. That's part of the blame is on us, the academics. Teach Israel studies, we teach India, and so we're convincing people to think in nationalist tunnel visions, and the historical actors themselves are much more, they understand that they are part of the same empire. So what happens in one end of the empire is there. 1947 is exactly when the Titanic called the British Empire already met the iceberg. And it's sinking fast. And partition comes back as the way for the British for a quick and dirty exit strategy from Palestine. Palestine is no longer an asset, it's a liability. They don't want the Tommies to govern Palestine and fight and chase after Begin and his friends. They don't want the taxpayer, and they're saying, UN, take this hot potato. We don't want it. And this is the history of, I mean, in a nutshell, the history of partition.
So I thought there were still a bunch more hands. I'm so sorry that our time has come to an end. But the fact that people have so many more questions they want to ask, I think, is a symptom of a wonderful talk that has generated so much food for thought. So thank you so much, Professor Dubnov. And please join us next week for our third talk in this series. All the information is on the flyer in front of you. We'd love to see you back. Thank you.